America, the land of innovation, prosperity, and unmatched economic power, or so we've been told. But behind the glittering skyscrapers and record-breaking stock markets lies a silent catastrophe, one that's ticking like a time bomb beneath our feet. A crisis so colossal that even the world's most powerful financial institutions are beginning to panic. America deserves to hear the truth about a number so large, so unimaginable that most people can't even comprehend it. $36 trillion. That's the national debt of the United States. Let that sink in. That's not the valuation of the entire tech industry. That's not even the GDP of China, Japan, Germany, the UK, and India combined. That is what the United States of America owes. And here's the terrifying part. That number isn't shrinking. It's growing. Every second, every heartbeat. As of early 2025, America's debt-to-GDP ratio has crossed 122.5%. For every dollar the U.S. economy produces, it owes over $1.22. And if policies remain unchanged, this figure is projected to exceed 140% by 2032. To understand how we got here, and why the IMF, the world's rating agencies, and economists like Ray Dalio are issuing dire warnings, we must first rewind the clock. Because this wasn't an accident. This was engineered, built over decades, one reckless decision at a time. For most of the 20th century, the U.S. was seen as a beacon of financial strength. After World War II, America emerged as the world's lender, not borrower. It helped rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan, led global institutions like the World Bank and IMF, and anchored the global financial system with the U.S. dollar at its core. But behind that strength lurked a hidden vulnerability, a growing dependence on debt. The turning point? 1971. That was the year President Richard Nixon severed the dollar's connection to gold, a decision that effectively untethered America's currency from physical backing. With the stroke of a pen, the Federal Reserve gained the ability to print money without limit. What followed was a gradual shift in mindset. Why earn what you can simply borrow? By the 1980s, America was in love with borrowing. Under President Ronald Reagan, a new ideology took root, one that would define U.S. economic policy for decades: Reaganomics. Its pillars were simple: cut taxes, cut regulation, supercharge the private sector. Reagan believed that if the wealthy and businesses paid fewer taxes, they would reinvest more into the economy, creating jobs, raising wages, and spurring innovation. This became known as trickle-down economics. But here's the reality. It didn't trickle down. It trickled up. In 1980, the U.S. national debt stood at $908 billion. By the end of Reagan's presidency, it had more than tripled to $2.6 trillion. Fast forward to 2025, and we're sitting at $36 trillion, a 39-fold increase. But where did all that money go? Let's take a closer look at America's spending habits. Today, nearly 70% of the federal budget goes to just 4 categories: defense spending, Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, interest payments on the debt. Here's the breakdown for fiscal year 2024. Defense, $842 billion. Social Security, $1.3 trillion. Medicare and Medicaid, $1.5 trillion. Interest on debt, $1 trillion. And yet, every year the U.S. runs a budget deficit, meaning it spends far more than it earns. In 2024 alone, that deficit hit $2.2 trillion. Why? Because the U.S. tax base hasn't kept up. Despite historic wealth, America collects less in taxes as a percentage of GDP than most developed countries. In 2022, the U.S. tax-to-GDP ratio was just 26%, far below the 34% average of OECD countries. Worse still, the richest Americans pay less and less. Since 1980, there have been 6 major tax cuts, most benefiting corporations and high-income earners. But the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, championed by Donald Trump, was one of the most impactful. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the top 20% of earners received over 65% of the total tax benefits. Meanwhile, the bottom 20% received just 3%. Here's what that looks like in practice. Jeff Bezos reportedly paid $0 in federal income taxes in 2007 and 2011. Elon Musk, the world's richest man, paid a true tax rate of less than 4% between 2014 and 2010. Meanwhile, the average American household paid between 14 and 24%, depending on income. The result? Staggering inequality. The US now has a Gini coefficient of 0.494, the highest among developed economies. For comparison, Germany's is 0.31, and Norway's is 0.26. With ballooning debt and shrinking tax revenue, there's another monster that has quietly grown: interest payments. In 2024, the US spent $1 trillion just on interest, more than it spends on defense. That's more than the GDP of 174 countries, including the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland. Here's the vicious cycle. The government borrows more to cover spending. More debt means higher interest payments. To pay the interest, it borrows even more. Rinse and repeat. This is the definition of a debt spiral. It's what bankrupts countries. And America, the world's richest nation, is now caught in it. To contain this madness, Congress introduced the concept of a debt ceiling, a legal limit on how much the government can borrow. In theory, it's supposed to enforce fiscal discipline. In reality, it's been raised or suspended over 70 times since 1960. It's no longer a warning. It's a rubber stamp. Every time America hits the ceiling, lawmakers stage a political drama, shutdowns, debates, market panic, only to raise it again. The ceiling isn't a ceiling. It's a ladder. And America keeps climbing. When the richest nation in history borrows beyond its means, the consequences are never isolated. The world is no longer watching America's debt spiral with curiosity. It's watching with fear. Because when America stumbles, the world falls. As the U.S. national debt races past $36 trillion and interest payments alone surpass $1 trillion annually, global financial markets are tightening their seatbelts. And for good reason. To understand why this matters to every country on Earth, from Germany to Ghana, from India to Indonesia, we need to follow the money. The United States borrows money by issuing treasury bonds. These are essentially IOUs backed by the US government. For decades, they've been considered the safest assets in the world. Central banks, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they all buy US treasury bonds as a way to preserve wealth. But what happens when the world's safest investment starts to look unsafe? Let's start with China. In 2012, China held over $1.3 trillion in US Treasury bonds. Today, just $759 billion. That's a 41% drop. Japan has followed a similar path, dropping from $1.84 trillion to just over $1.06 trillion. Why? Because as the US debt balloons and political infighting paralyzes Washington, confidence in American fiscal responsibility is eroding. Even major US allies like South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and Germany are reducing their exposure to American bonds. And here's where it gets dangerous. Because when demand for US bonds drops, the government must offer higher interest rates to attract investors. Higher interest means more debt service. More debt service means more borrowing. And the cycle spirals out of control. This is the scenario economists fear: a full-blown debt spiral. According to Dalio, billionaire investor and founder of Bridgewater Associates, the United States is not just in a financial slowdown, it's approaching what he calls an economic heart attack. Over the next year alone, the US must roll over more than $9 trillion in maturing debt. And that's just to keep the lights on. Now, imagine trying to refinance that debt in a market where your own credibility is in question. Welcome to the financial red zone. This brings us to the most alarming development yet. Donald Trump's proposed One Big Beautiful Bill. On the surface, it sounds patriotic, pro-growth, pro-jobs. But in reality, this bill makes Trump's 2017 tax cuts permanent, slashes welfare programs, ramps up defense spending, and adds an estimated $3.3 to $5.2 trillion to the national debt. That's nearly equivalent to the entire GDP of India and Germany combined. If this bill becomes law, the U.S. annual deficit could soar to nearly $3.3 trillion per year. Interest payments could hit $1.8 trillion by the end of the decade. And when interest payments are your largest budget item, larger than defense, larger than healthcare, you're not governing anymore. You're bleeding. Credit rating agencies aren't waiting around. In 2023, Fitch downgraded the U.S. credit rating. In early 2025, Moody's followed suit. When credit ratings drop, investors demand even higher interest rates, which means more debt, more interest, more panic. This is where the nightmare scenario begins. Because if U.S. bonds start to look unstable, the entire global financial system shakes. Banks use U.S. treasuries as collateral. Pension funds rely on them for stability. International trade is denominated in dollars, backed by these bonds. A collapse in bond credibility could trigger a financial earthquake. And make no mistake, the tremors are already being felt. In India, the Sensex and Nifty indices have already begun showing signs of foreign investor exit. Billions of dollars are being pulled out of Indian stocks and redirected to high-yield US bonds. It's not that India is weak. It's that in times of crisis, capital flees to safety. Except this time, the definition of safety is changing. When the US faces a debt ceiling crisis or political chaos, the world's safest harbor becomes a storm. In 2011, during a similar downgrade, Indian markets dropped nearly 10%. The rupee weakened. Inflation spiked. India currently holds more than $237 billion in US Treasury bonds. If those bonds lose value, the Reserve Bank of India's ability to defend the rupee erodes. This isn't just theory. It's history repeating. And while stock markets may bounce back, the second impact is more dangerous: currency chaos. Every time the dollar shakes, the rupee tumbles. And when the rupee falls, everything from fuel to food becomes more expensive for Indian families. The global south, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, they're all watching nervously. Because if the US sneezes, they catch pneumonia. So what happens next? The Federal Reserve has only a few options left. One of them is called quantitative easing, or QE. This involves printing more money to buy bonds, stabilize rates, and inject liquidity. It's been used multiple times before, after the 2008 crisis during the COVID-19 pandemic. But printing more money when debt is already out of control is like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It may work temporarily, but it doesn't solve the deeper problem: systemic, uncontrolled borrowing. If the US continues on this path, economists warn of a doom loop, where debt, interest, inflation, and collapse feed into each other endlessly. So what can be done? Ironically, the solution is simple but politically impossible. Raise taxes on the wealthy. Cut unnecessary defense spending. Reform entitlement programs. And above all, restore fiscal discipline. But in today's hyper-polarized America, none of these are likely. So where does that leave us? With a $36 trillion bomb that could detonate any day. If America collapses under its own debt, it won't be a soft landing. It will be a global shockwave. Trade will freeze. Currencies will crash. Jobs will vanish. And history will remember that the greatest economy in the world was not destroyed by enemies, but by its own arrogance. All we can hope is that it doesn't happen in our lifetime. Not in 2025. That's all for now. For more such deep dive documentaries on economics, politics, and global power, don't forget to subscribe. The world is changing. Stay informed.